I'm Hemant Mehta.
And I'm Jessica Blimke.
And you're listening to the podcast for FriendlyAtheist.com. You can now listen to all of our episodes and see show notes at FriendlyAtheistPodcast.com.
Katherine Stewart is an investigative journalist who has written for Rolling Stone, The Nation, The New York Times, and The Guardian. She may be best known as the author of The Good News Club, about an organization bringing religious fundamentalism to elementary schools across the country. Katherine, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about the Good News Club to begin with, and we'll branch off from there. So for those who don't know, what is the Good News Club, and why is it something we should be worried about?
Sure. Good News Clubs, which are sponsored by an organization called the Child Evangelism Fellowship, are these after-school programs of religious indoctrination that are largely held in public schools. There are presently about 4,000 of these clubs in public elementary schools around the country. I
4,000?
just want to say not just public schools. Pardon?
4,000?
Nearly 4,000 of them, and they hold them in elementary schools because they really target children in those first years of learning. The purpose of the clubs is to convert very young children to a fundamentalist form of the Christian religion and to try to get them and their families to join certain types of churches. They call them Bible-believing churches. And the children attending the clubs are also told to try to recruit their peers to the club. At every training that I attended, children were offered points or prizes or sometimes even candy for bringing their peers to the club.
Wow.
Now, they take place after school, and they do require parental permission to join. So, a lot of people think, what's the big deal? But I want to tell you why people should be concerned about Good News Clubs. First of all, the biggest concern, in my view, is that they deceive very young children into thinking that their public school endorses a particular form of the Christian religion. Look, little kids, as young as 5 or 6 years old, are very impressionable, and the public school has a kind of cloak of authority in their minds. Anyone who either has young kids or has worked with them knows that they think if something takes place in their school, it must be what the school wants them to believe. And the Good News Club leaders know that, and that's why they've been so insistent on holding these clubs in public schools, even when, for instance, like a nearby church offers free space, at the exact same time. That happened in our community. An evangelical church literally next door to the school said, "Oh, we have great space we'd like to offer to you for free." And the Good News Club leaders declined. They insisted on being in the public school.
And so this is is legal, though, right? Like, because they are after school.
This is legal. It's because of a 2001 Supreme Court decision called Good News Club versus Milford Central School, in which the club argued that basically, if the school opens what's known as a limited public forum, sort of legally known, technically known as a limited public forum, which is to say if they let in after-school soccer, or if they, let in after-school volleyball or art, they can't exclude a religious club,
right,
because that's a violation of their free speech. So basically what they've done is that a Supreme Court decision swiped aside Establishment Clause concerns and basically isn't treating religion as religion. It's treating it as just speech from a certain point of view.
Sure. So this is not a legal battle we are talking about. This is kind of a more moral battle, and we should still be concerned, even if it's legal for other reasons. And you were saying, what was the other concern?
Well, there are other concerns as well. I think, Good News Clubs also deceive parents. Many parents sign their kids up to the clubs thinking that they represent a kind of mainstream form of the Christian religion. But in fact, most activists I met who work with Good News Clubs believe, that most American Christians really aren't, including, Catholics, United Methodists, Episcopalians, the list goes on. So a lot of people don't really understand what the Good News Clubs are teaching. The Good News Club, their marketing materials are very simple. They'll say, we're going to play games and give prizes and teach your kids to be good people. And
who's going to say no to that?
They offer free aftercare. So most parents think, great, free aftercare. My kid will learn to be, behave. What could be wrong? And their curriculum is in fact, it emphasizes punishment and sin and that kind of thing. There was somebody who did an independent study. Their 5-year curriculum. They have textbooks, and these lesson plan is supposed to be taught in every Good News Club from coast to coast. And that person who did the study found over 5,000 references, thousands of references to sin, hell, and punishment, and only two. That person who conducted the study asserted there were only 2 or 3 glancing references to the Golden Rule or the Royal Law, which is loving your neighbor as yourself.
Good news indeed.
Yeah. I mean, that's really the perfect name for a club, too.
Course.
Who's going to say no to something called the Good News Club?
Yeah, that was no mistake.
Right.
Exactly. When the first Good News Club, I got onto this whole thing when a Good News Club came to my daughter's public elementary school, and I really just thought, what's the big deal? But then I started to hear stories from parents I knew whose kids went to schools where Good News Clubs had just been established. And I started to hear about how kids attending the clubs were, things had been cool and great, and then all of a sudden kids attending these clubs are starting to target their peers for what I could only describe as faith-based bullying and bigotry. They sort of figure out which kid in their class is a member of a religious minority group, and then, go up to them and start berating them for not believing in Jesus. And then they would say, this is the most concerning part, because of course kids can learn these things on their own time off campus, but these kids would say, I know it must be true because I learned it in school, and they don't teach things in school that aren't true. I don't have a problem with kids talking with their friends about their religion, but I do have a problem with kids being deceived into thinking that their school endorses a particular form of religion and then using that false, that misperception to try to berate their peers.
And it's just amazing that this is legal, but it seems like these people who run these groups, the Good News Club, they found a loophole that allows them to exploit something that's legal to their ends, which is kind of evil, genius, brilliant.
It feels slimy.
It's totally slimy. But it works because these kids are 5.
Yeah.
They're not discerning about what's going on. They're like, oh, I learned you have to believe this to be good. And of course they're going to tell their friends to join them and come after school with them.
Yeah.
And it's hard to stand up and say, well, I don't believe this stuff when you're a kid.
Yeah.
Katherine, I think you even mentioned something, maybe it was in one of your lectures or maybe it was in the book, about something called the 4 to 14 window.
Oh, right. Yes.
What is that?
When I started researching the book, I really wanted to learn where this focus on children was coming from, because I started to see this intense focus on kids. And I realized that I found a book by one of the most influential mission strategists named Louise Bush. In any business, like in the sports equipment business, there are people who are like strategists who tell you how to market, or in business consulting there are these, I don't know what their names are. I've heard, Jack Welch, I don't know, these very famous, consultants who kind of tell everybody what to do, and their ideas are followed very broadly. Mm-hmm. So Louise Bush is one of these folks in the evangelical world, one of quite a few, but he is one of the very top mission strategists. And he wrote a book called The 414 Window. I can't remember the subtitle, something like Raising Up a New Generation to Transform the World or something like that. And it starts with the idea that the vast majority of conversions to evangelical Christianity happen before or a child's 14th birthday. So that's where evangelicals should kind of focus their efforts, their missionary efforts. And it's concerning because it takes for granted the idea that for evangelical Christians, spreading their religion involves exploiting the immaturity or lack of emotional development of children and the sort of lack of worldly awareness that characterizes small children. And I should stress that in the case of Good News Clubs, the children involved in these missionary efforts are actually other people's kids. They're not their own children. They're really, the Good News Clubs, they're not converting their own kids. Their real focus is on converting other people's children in their public schools. When I was doing my research in this, I didn't really meet anyone within the organization who shared my concern that trying to convert other people's kids is inappropriate. So I thought that was pretty interesting. The religious right wing likes to claim that they promote what they call family values, but they treat families that don't look like theirs with a kind of contempt.
Yeah. I feel like, so us talking about this, it's clearly, like Hammond said, kind of an evil genius. It's clearly icky. They don't see it this way. Like, are they seeing
They think they're
themselves
saving the world.
Right. Is that what their motivation is? Because it feels so maniacal.
If any other group besides Christians was doing the same thing,
they'd lose their
they would
minds.
flip out.
Well, this is an interesting thing I found is that when other religions try to exercise their so-called rights in the same way that the majority religion does, or people who are members of the perceived majority religion, they're really shut down. I mean, there's so many examples of this. There was a family in Miami, Oklahoma, a Muslim family, that saw that their school was distributing Bibles, and they decided to try to distribute the Quran on the same basis
I bet that went really
as
well.
Bibles. They said, well, gosh, if you're allowed to distribute your religious texts, the Gideons, they said, well, we can distribute ours. And you can imagine what happened with them. They were, they got so much hate mail and so many death threats, they feared for their lives. And
in Orange County,
happened.
Yeah, we saw it in Orange County, Florida, where the Satanists and atheists wanted to do the same thing. And the district eventually, after a long, drawn-out battle in a sense, they finally said, fine, we'll just stop the distributions or come up with a new policy that will deal with all this.
Which is what we wanted all along.
In a sense, yeah.
It's so frustrating.
I know. This whole idea that a public school is just a forum for every, little, group to kind of get their crack at the kids, and as long as it's neutral, it's okay, it's just free speech. I frankly disagree with that. I mean, I frankly want everyone to have their freedoms recognized, and I want religious and non-religious people to have equal opportunity and not be discriminated. But I disagree fundamentally that religion can just be reduced to another kind of speech when it comes to public schools, and that it can be treated like everything else in the legal system. I mean, religions, by virtue of the Constitution, have protections that other groups simply don't have. They get significant tax privileges to the tune of, over $100 billion over the last 10 years, according to some recent studies. And by virtue of the Constitution, they also have all kinds of privileges and exemptions from the law. They're, for instance, exempt from employment anti-discrimination laws, and they're allowed to engage in the kind of speech that get other groups banned from public school campuses. They're allowed to tell children that they're sinners and deserve to die, which is something that the Good News Clubs tell kids. And all of that is protected as religion, but with those protections comes a price, which is that they have to be treated in some way differently than other forms of speech, and they have to be treated in a way that avoids entanglement between the church and the school, between religion and the school.
If you could wave a magic wand of some sort, what do you want to see happen? Because I would think if you're saying the solution is we should not be allowed to have these religious Good News Clubs and any other type of religious club, they're going to fight back by saying, no, you're taking away our religious freedom. This is a free speech issue.
You know what? I mean, public schools public schools are for education. Education is not anything goes. It's about having a certain set of facts and skills to teach children so they can have a better future. I want everyone to have their freedoms, but I think we have to take the educational mission of the schools very seriously. Yes, it's great to have free speech in schools, but your right to free speech ends when my daughter's biology class begins. I don't want to give weight, to your point of view that the earth is 6,000 years old. More generally, I think that diminishes the standing of the school as a genuine source of knowledge.
Of course, but that is during the school day, and these are taking place outside of the school day. So is there any legitimate way you could even how could anyone make that argument, I guess? I'm playing devil's advocate here, but how can anyone make the argument when it happens outside of school?
Right. I think age matters a great deal. There's a general way of saying, that I think deceiving small kids is very easy and it's very bad. I don't have a problem at the high school level or even middle school with groups that are genuinely student-led and that don't attempt to coerce non-members and that don't involve deceiving anybody about their connection with or endorsement by the school. Like, for instance, in high schools, I think there are plenty of after-school religious and non-religious and atheist groups, and I generally have no problem with them. With older kids, it's much easier to establish that the activities are genuinely student-led, that they don't involve coercing non-members, and that they don't involve deceiving students about the school's endorsement of the group. But, going after kindergartners is a different story. By the way, I want to point out that political clubs are excluded generally from public elementary schools.
There's no super young Republicans.
No, you don't have an adult leading a group of young Democrats or an adult coming into the school and teaching, the kindergarten Republicans. That just doesn't happen.
And what's the reason?
Those are excluded because it is rightly recognized that would confuse people, that the political point of view being promoted in the school was being endorsed by the school and hence the state. And nobody cries foul there. Everybody just sort of agrees. But when it comes to religious groups, this particular group has recognized that they're gaining a significant advantage by doing this, and that's why they've sort of staked that space and they're determined to defend it.
So if I wanted to start a club for young Democrats in an elementary school, you're telling me, and I went through all the proper procedure.
You wouldn't be allowed to.
I wouldn't be allowed to?
No, and you also can't electioneer in a public school. I mean, in any public school, because our legal system has long recognized that that kind of activity it's an inappropriate entanglement of the government with religion.
Well, and along those lines, I heard that a group of atheists started something called the Better News Club as sort of
as a tongue-in-cheek pushback against this.
Do you think that that's appropriate? Do you think it's effective?
I don't know that much about the Better News Club. I've never seen their curriculum. What I have heard is that it's not a religious club, that they don't address the issue of religion, but they're there to teach critical thinking.
Right.
And
I can't just to be clear on this is just one group of parents who said there is a good news club at our kids' elementary school. Yeah. Let's start a Better News Club just to give kids an alternative. And it is kind of more of a protest than anything else, it seems. But they'll say they're genuinely interested in this. But it's kind of just saying, we're going to teach critical thinking. We're not going to promote atheism. Yeah. But more than anything else, they want to play the same game that the Good News Club is playing. And let's see what happens.
Again, if I could wave the magic wand, create the perfect world. Frankly, I think, public schools should not be turned into religious battlegrounds. Yeah. I think in order for our public schools to function effectively in a society as diverse as ours, I think we should all set aside our agendas. Us adults, we should set aside our political agendas, our religious agendas, and really come together in support of our children, their collective future. I can't comment on this Better News Club because I don't know that much about it. I've never seen any of the materials. But
I don't think they have any, for what it's worth.
I do think it's really interesting that the fact that there are nearly 4,000 Good News Clubs in public elementary schools across the country, and that doesn't really get a whole lot of media coverage. And then one club that actually claims to not be religious is starting a one club in upstate New York or wherever it is, and all of a sudden it gets media coverage. I think that's quite extraordinary. It reminds me a little bit. It's funny when the Good News Club came to our public elementary school. A friend of mine was, our public school in Santa Barbara had, a lot of religious diversity. And a friend of mine is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And she said, can you imagine if we did this? It would be all over the national news. And she is probably right. And you kind of see when there's a perspective that's not a perspective endorsed by, the perceived majority. I mean, frankly.
Right. I mean, it's a dog bites man sort of story. It's not the one it's a man bites dog sort of story where you're not used to hearing that one, so everyone's covering it. Yeah. But when you have all these Christian groups, it's just, that's the way it is. I guess there's no story there.
True. It's true.
Let's talk about
I think that they get a lot of cover because they present themselves as broadly Christian. Right. But anybody who spends a little bit of time with their curriculum materials will see that they really aren't. So
this is not mainstream. This is very fundamentalist.
Yeah, a number of parents came to me when I was doing my research and said, my daughter came home. I sent her to a Good News Club. She came home and she said, Mommy, Daddy, we're going to go to hell because we don't go to the right church.
Oh boy.
So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your new article in The Nation, which is kind of taking this as a jumping point and saying it's kind of saying evangelicals are trying to basically put a church in every school. What do you mean by that? What are you saying?
Well, there is, some of the same legal theory that has allowed for good news clubs to appear in public elementary schools has helped to pave the way for placing churches operating in public elementary schools. Now, it's very different in that they are, in many instances, renting the space, although in some instances they're not renting the space. For instance, in New York City, there were, I believe it was 160 houses of worship operating rent-free in public schools in New York City.
So just to be clear, like at the public school in my area, if you drive past that school on a Sunday morning, the parking lot is pretty full, and it's because a local church rents out the auditorium, which is a nice auditorium, and people go to church, but it's just taking place at our public school. They pay rent.
That's true. Although I think, everybody, I don't know what kind of rent they pay at your public school. Our public school near us, there's a church that rents out the space every Sunday for $100 a week. Now, I think everybody can recognize that this is a substantial boon to the religious organization paying so-called rent. It's a subsidy, really, because, for $100, they get this beautiful space. They get furniture, heating and cooling,
parking,
air conditioning, bathrooms, multiple classrooms. So it presents a substantial savings over whether they had, if they had to fund their own building.
Well, it works because public schools are loaded and churches have no money. So I'm really glad that they've struck a deal.
So what's the problem with these churches renting out these public school spaces? Let's assume for a second that they were paying fair rent on Sundays or something like that. What would be the problem with that?
Well, I want to talk about the entity, the church entity in particular, that I wrote about. It's in Florida. It's a church called the Venue Church, and they don't. If you look at their materials on their website, they don't appear to have that much faith in the school. They sort of bemoan the fact that the school building school has become the place where values are set, and they're determined to establish their church in the public schools. They state a goal of placing a church in every public school in their area within the next 10 years. So it's a tricky one, because on the one hand you can say, look, if they're paying fair rent, doesn't that give the school some money to help perpetuate their mission? Absolutely, it is. But at the same time, it is a kind of almost like a soft establishment. People start to associate the authority of the school with the authority of a particular religious viewpoint.
Help me connect the dots here. So let's say they are meeting in the school, but it's on a weekend. It's not during the school day. How are they putting any sort of dent into the public school when they're meeting on weekends and stuff? Like, even if they wanted to establish a church in these public schools, help me understand how meeting on a Sunday or something is going to seep its way into the school day when kids are there.
Well, it may not. On the other hand, in this particular church, the pastor of the church acts as a quote-unquote life coach for the football team. So he does involve himself with the life of the school. I think he used to call himself the chaplain of the football team, and then I believe the FFRF sent a letter saying you're not allowed to do that, and he changed the title of what he said to life coach.
So they're basically integrating their way into the school community. And now we've seen a lot of football teams that public schools have baptisms and team chaplains and prayers before or after a game, and they're not student led, which it would be okay, but these are coach-led or chaplain-led. That I can totally get the legal problem with that. But what you're suggesting, I guess, is that these churches are pushing their way into the schools and then finding a way to
blur the lines.
Yeah, and work their way into the system.
Yeah, I would have to say that some do and some don't. Some have a more aggressive mission than others. But I think it's interesting that this is also occurring in the context of the general defunding of public education. So in that area in Florida, for instance, the election of, Tea Party and other quote unquote small government officials means that the public schools in general have suffered enormous budget cuts. They're really struggling for money. So it creates a kind of vacuum. They're really desperate for any kind of money, any kind of help. And then what often happens is that faith-based organizations, which are largely, not exclusively, but, largely evangelical Christian, say, oh, well, we'd like to come in, we'd like to start offering this to the kids and that to the kids, and, we
can supply them with these things that they need.
I would prefer that my public school has enough money to paint their own facility and, frankly, give the work to somebody who, could use it and get paid a fair wage for it, than to rely on the charity of religion that, wants to tell my kid that they're going to go to hell unless they convert to to their religion,
Yeah, I can't imagine how infuriating that would be. Like, I don't have kids, but I feel like if I had a kid come home and be like, Mom, guess what I learned today? I'm going to hell. Like, that has to be infuriating.
Well, the thing is, when we moved from Santa Barbara to New York City and we were living across the street from our public school, we could see the door to the public school from our apartment. And on Sundays, people would stand outside. Oh, listen to this, okay? So they'd stand outside. They'd hand out candy on the street, including my friend and her daughter, and they'd invite them to the church at their school. And so my daughter came home and she goes, oh, Mommy, is the church part of our school? Yep. And I said, no, honey. I had to, explain again. It was an elementary school. High school is sort of a different story. At that age, kids can make that distinction. But in public elementary school, they absolutely cannot. So I said, no, the church is not part of our school. So I decided to go to services one day. And the pastor, we were sitting in a room surrounded by pictures of my daughter and her friends. They had sort of put these
around the school,
made posters of themselves, and and they had their names up. And the pastor said, "Notice the names of the children on the piece of paper. Pray for them and pray that the families of this school, I can't remember exactly how he said it. He told us to pray for the kids and pray. Oh, he said, pray that the families of these children will come to know that this is the house of God."
Wow.
So there I am, mandated by law to send my child to this public elementary school where her image and her name is going to get involved in the religious rituals of a faith that I don't subscribe to. That to me feels like an inappropriate mixing of government with religion.
Right. So I know we alluded to this earlier, but what is the best way to respond to this? Do we fight fire with fire and try to set up atheist versions of the same thing purely not to indoctrinate kids into atheism, but to just push back against this? Or is there another way parents can do something about this? Because I'm not sure there is a legal way to fight back based on what you're saying.
Well, I'm not a lawyer. So, there have been other people who have thought about different sort of legal ways to fight back, and I'm not in a position to, endorse any of them. And, I really feel like the first step in meeting any challenge is to kind of let people know that it exists. So I think it's really important, if we're talking about good news clubs, to kind of let people know about them, let people
educate them about what the curriculum is.
Yeah.
Let people know what they believe and let people know what harm it does. I think we really should be fighting to reaffirm some of our basic constitutional principles. I think parents, of course, should be prepared to deal with the kind of faith-based bullying and bigotry that can arise when when these divisive religious groups come into the public elementary schools and start, and when that leads to children sort of targeting their peers for faith-based bullying and bigotry. Again, I don't approve of any religious organization, putting its clubs in the public schools and going after kindergartners and, say, telling atheist kindergartens to go after quote-unquote churched kids. And, that would be the equivalent because they tell the Good News Club kids to go after quote-unquote unchurched kids. But, I would never approve of anything like that. But, different activist groups might have their own opinions on that. I do think it's interesting when the forum, this idea of a neutral forum gets tested, and we can see that it really isn't as neutral as it claims to be.
Can the students themselves do anything, or do they risk something in pushing back against this?
Have any elementary school students done anything?
I feel like asking like an 8-year-old to be like
Yeah.
stand up against an
like
authority
6-year-old
figure.
to organize and,
Right.
and go to the principal and say we don't like this. Even if they did, frankly, the principal's hands are generally tied because of that 2001 Supreme Court decision, Good News Club versus Milford Central School. It's very challenging. And I really feel, frankly, sorry for a lot of the school administrators. Most of them are not equipped to deal with the kind of needless religious wars that erupt when Good News Clubs force their way into the public schools. Let's remember, Good News Clubs force their ways in. They're not invited. They have all of these documents that they present and sort of showing that they have a right to be there and, demanding that they pay the least amount of use fee possible and things like that. So, when they show up, a lot of principals sort of have told me, gosh, we're so busy dealing with, budget cuts and issues about administration and education. I really don't want to be dealing with this.
Well, and they can't. Like you're saying, this is not a legal, it's not that they're doing anything illegal. It's that they're playing by the rules set up by the system, and the principals couldn't say no, even if they wanted to. They kind of have to let them in, right?
You know what? I'll tell you something. If there were 4,000, say, Wiccan clubs in public elementary schools trying to, convert children to the Wiccan faith, you can bet there would be such a public outcry that people would find a way to exclude them. I mean, we saw this when, for instance, the Church of Scientology came up with some program and placed them in public elementary schools in California. And when enough parents became aware that the program was affiliated with the Scientology Church of Scientology, it was excluded. And the same thing happened when there was a Kabbalah Center program that was going into some public schools.
Do you know how they're excluded? I'm trying to figure out, on what basis could you say no to the Scientology program?
I don't know that because I'm not really aware of the sort of minutiae of that court fight.
I can understand the public outcry against it, but I'm still trying to figure out
the legal
how could you say no? I don't know that you could. But if there was enough unpopularity behind it and parents were just very clear, my kid's not joining that and we're going to convince everybody that this is a bad idea, there just wouldn't be enough interest. Right. But that's a lot harder to do when it's Christianity versus everything else, it seems.
It's really interesting. A lot of money buys a lot of law. The reason this has happened is because this wasn't sort of a kind of a one-off or an accident, that Good News Club decision. In the early 80s, the religious right decided to invest an enormous amount of money in their legal strategy, and then groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, Liberty Council, American Center for Law and Justice got together and brought the right cases to the right courts over a number of years to create the groundwork for this Good News Club decision. Right. And the first thing that they really did was kind of it was basically a way of calling, of reframing religion, not as religion, but as speech from a certain point of view. Yeah.
And you could say there's some silver linings, because once they got Christian clubs allowed in high school or something, that also led to gay straight alliances and secular student alliances forming, but not nearly at the same rate and not at the same numbers for sure.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one last question. Where do you go from here? What do you research next? Do you still work on, if you're writing articles, are you focused still on religion in public schools? Or are you interested in tackling a completely different topic? Are you burned out on this one?
I wrote an article recently about potatoes. It was so much fun. It's like a food story. I was so excited to get to write about something other than religion. But I really did. I wrote a food story. I wrote another really sort of fun story for Santa Barbara Magazine, which is the magazine I used to write for on a regular basis when I lived in Santa Barbara. But, I'm still really interested in writing about religious fundamentalism. I'm really interested in the spread of all kinds of fundamentalisms, not just Christian fundamentalism, but other religious fundamentalisms in the U.S. and in the world. And It's so funny. I have a friend who's also has written about fundamentalism, and she doesn't anymore. Except once she said to me, it's like a bad boyfriend. You just keep going back.
You keep going back there.
But it's funny. It is something that I'm just very deeply interested in, and continue to explore and write about. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah,
Yes.
It's interesting. I tell people I write a website about atheism. They're like, well, how much can you really talk about, what
God, so much.
God doesn't exist? Like, how much material can you get out of that? It's like, I am never not busy writing about it. There's so many stories about religious fundamentalism and the impact religion has on society. There's more than enough material for everyone.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I find also that fundamentalist forms of religion really fascinating. It's amazing to me how much attraction that they have for people.
Absolutely. It's frustrating, and thank you for all the work you're doing and kind of exposing this and educating so many people about these issues and the Good News Club and all the other church encroachment into public space that you write about. So thank you for your time and for your work.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's really a pleasure to speak with you guys.
Thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the podcast for FriendlyAtheist.com. This episode was taped at Cinnamon Sound Studios in Aurora, Illinois. The music was composed by Brad Chagdis. If you like what you're hearing, please consider making a contribution at patreon.com/Hemant. That's He-Man T. We appreciate your support. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at friendlyatheistpodcast@gmail.com. I'm Hemant Mehta.
And I'm Jessica Blumke. We hope you'll join us next time.